So, hi everyone. Please join me in welcoming Mark Lance. They are a professor of philosophy in the Department of Philosophy and the program of Peace and Justice at Georgetown University. Or I guess it's Professor Emeritus now. Well, thanks for coming to talk with us, Mark.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Yeah, if anybody wanted to put their camera on, I'd love to see your faces, but obviously you don't have to. Okay, so since you were calling your group this anarchist theory organization, I thought I'd just be contentious and give you a talk against theory. Because I'm very serious about this. I don't think the best way to forward anarchist adjacent politics is through anarchist theory. And I want to kind of explain why quickly. I'm going to start with a kind of a little story, true story, that we'll just leave in the background for you to think about as I go through this. So yeah, I was a professor in the philosophy department at Georgetown for, I don't know, 35 years or something like that. I got incredibly lucky in my academic career, not just at getting a job and getting a good job, but falling into a department where people listened to one another, made arguments, talked about issues, and followed the argument where it led. Over the course of those 35 years, I counted. So officially, right, the procedures for any decision in the department was to vote, right? A typical departmental thing. Over those 35 years, I think there were about 5 total votes that were not unanimous. And the reason was that people talked about shit until it became clear what the best thing to do was. And then everyone did it, whether they walked in initially with the idea that that was a good thing or not, or whether it was in their interest or not. Everyone took each other seriously. This is very rare in academia. I had another colleague who was in one of our meetings once pull me from another department, pull me aside and say, "Is this normal?" And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, everyone listened to each other and took each other seriously and revised their views when there were arguments." I was like, "Yeah." She said, "Can I change to your department?" Anyway, the specific story is that there was one time when there was an actually contentious vote. It was a hiring decision. So first of all, the kind of decision where you either got to hire this person or not hire this person. There's not really any sort of compromise in between on that. One part of the department felt very strongly this was the right person to hire. Another part of the department felt very strongly that it wasn't the right person to hire. And we talked it through and we argued, must have gone for like 3 hours. And very few people had their opinion changed. We were kind of at this deadline. So finally the chair's like, "Well, okay, let's vote," because that's what we do. So we voted and it was, I don't know, sort of like 17-13 in favor of hiring them. And we were proceeding to get up and leave, report this to the dean. And a person on the winning side of the vote said, "Wait a minute, I'm really uncomfortable with this. This isn't what we do. We don't have split decisions like this. And I really feel like I'm really worried that the minority is getting bullied here." And the person who had been the most vociferous person on the losing side of the vote said, "No, absolutely not. You all listened to my arguments all through this whole thing. Everybody considered everything. We haven't come to an agreement. The only rational thing for us to do is to go with what the majority wants here." So there was consensus on going with not consensus. I'll just leave that there. Again, that was a group, this is a philosophy department, right? I mean, it's good, respectful people. Certainly at that time, there was exactly one of us who thought of ourselves as an anarchist. There may be 2 now, vaguely, depending on how you define it. People ranged from leftist politics to liberal politics to kind of conservative Catholic politics in the department. Consensus decision-making was not part of the ideology of the department. Okay, just keep that in the back of your mind for a second. So I take anarchism to be an approach to social and political organization. It's an account of essentially a commitment to building human society through non-hierarchical means. Exactly what we mean by that, one can talk about. But in order to organize society through non-hierarchical means consistently, you require the meaningful participation of essentially all people, right? People have to be engaged in the decisions that affect them. They have to have a say in those decisions. They can't be just simply, even if that say is, you know more about X than I do. Like, it's a famous quote of Bakunin where he says, reject authority, of course not. Farthest thing from my mind. When I buy a pair of shoes, I respect the authority of the shoemaker. When I do this, and he says, it's my choice to figure out who I take to be knowledgeable and wise, and my choice whether to follow them. Okay, so, but the main point is you can't just have good people in charge making the decisions in the interests of everyone else. That's sort of contrary to the whole spirit of the project. Meaningful participation, this is my sort of second main premise, is that meaningful participation requires us to develop skills of interacting with one another rationally, with respect. I would even say, if you understand this word correctly, with love. It isn't a matter of writing down a bunch of rules. I sent along a paper you could have a look at with some arguments for why rules are never sufficient for having, meaningful participatory democratic participation. But I think the example of my philosophy department is one where there are absolutely no rules pushing toward consensus, but we always got there. And the skills this is a skill, like anything else. And then my third premise is that skill comes from practice, not from theory. You don't get skillful at a thing from reading a book about it. You get skillful at a thing by practicing it and training and, being guided by others who are more skillful than you. Okay, that's a short little sort of three premise argument. What does participatory horizontal organization look like? It's easy to say really generic things like everybody's taken seriously, no one dominates. But specifically, to get to specifics around it is much harder. First of all, there are massive differences across context. The issues that arise in making collective decisions in a steel mill are very different than those that arise in a philosophy department, to say nothing of, an army. When we begin to build necessary larger scale structures, ones that might connect a participatory group in Columbus to one in DC, for example, things are even more complicated. We can't bring 1 million people together in a seminar room and have a nice discussion. So what sorts of representation are called for? I want to plug an old book here that looks at the way this worked in detail in revolutionary Catalonia from 1900 to 1930. It was a book by Murray Bookchin called Spanish Anarchists, the Heroic Years. And what's fascinating about it is how complicated it was. Everyone had a sort of ideology, but when that ideology met reality, how do we connect the issues of isolated farmers with those of people working in a factory, with women, with queers? It's extraordinary some of the issues that people were dealing with in 1920s Spain. They had to make shit up on the fly in complicated contextual ways that, importantly, I don't think anyone could have seen coming ahead of time. Anyway, I urge you to take a look at that book at some point. I think even though it's kind of just a a history. I think it's an enormously useful one. And more equally importantly, as we get closer to implementing non-hierarchical organization in many of these different domains of life, the contexts in which we're building it are going to change. Some are going to disappear. We aren't going to have cops or a standing military in an anarchist society. I take that much is at least clear. And others are going to be radically transformed. I do think we'll have universities. I think we'll have people who spend their time thinking and teaching, but boy, will they look different. As Amy was talking about some of the leadership of universities. Now, we all know that universities have been rapidly corporatizing over the last 20 years, from a beginning that was certainly not radical to start with, but at least was far more inclusive and participatory, say 30 or 40 years ago than it is now. That'll all change radically, even if we have the thing. What will a family look like when it's freed from the constraints of capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and all of the authoritarian reflexes that all of us have been brought up with? My claim is not just that we don't know the answer to those questions, but that we're not in a good epistemic position to consider them. Or at least not as good a position as the people a generation after us will be, right? I mean, we have all been trained by a world in which most of the formal structures are hierarchically organized, right? We've been trained to sit here and listen to me talk to you for an hour before you get a chance to say things. Please interrupt me anytime you want to if you think I say something stupid. It's all right. I do sometimes. So I think, and I actually think this has been a consistent theme in anarchist thinking from the early 20th century, at least, that what we're trying to do is build a world which can raise people who will know more about how to build a world than we do. And that means that it's precisely misguided to lay down a theory about how all that's going to go ahead of time. There's lots and lots of letters from the Spanish anarchists criticizing the Soviet Marxists on precisely these grounds. It's like, what do you mean you're going to lay out the blueprint for the fucking revolution? You guys don't even know what the issues of the revolution will be. And there are obviously more famous issues, but in some ways, I think this kind of experimentalist, pragmatic, anti-doctrinal dimension marks one of the deepest divisions between the Marxist tradition and the anarchist tradition. There's also many connections between those traditions, of course, as well. Okay, so if that's right, that we're not in a position to figure out what the ultimate goal of revolutionary change is, and B, we're not going to get better at it by writing theories, then, how do we get there? Well, we get there gradually in a kind of, I hate this word, dialectical process, by building gradually richer, more epistemically authoritative practices that will then be in a position to see what was wrong with the practices we built. So in a weird way, I want to claim that, there's different things you can mean by revolution. If anarchism is certainly revolutionary in the sense that it wants to be radical, it wants to challenge some of the deepest organizing principles of our society, not make superficial changes. But if revolution means sort of a sudden, quick, change everything at once practice, then I think actually anarchism is decidedly not revolutionary. It's inherently one that is an ongoing process style approach to thinking about the world. Okay. So the sort of the long and short of that is to say that I think we need to be doing is, excuse me, teaching ourselves and our fellow society mates to have the skills necessary to function more horizontally across all the dimensions of life. And that's a thing that requires practice and experimentation. So where do we get practice of that sort in a world that's, fucked up, to use the technical political term for it, right? We're trying to build capacity on the one hand to meaningfully challenge fundamental systems, capitalism, militarism, racism, imperialism, all of that stuff. And sometimes we can form semi-autonomous, semi-separatist communities and build new ways of living together, right? There's a million examples, farming communes of the 60s. Philosopher named Alexis Shotwell wrote some great stuff about lesbian separatist houses in Toronto in the 1980s that started inventing language for things like trans identities and stuff like this. You could think about, the Zapatistas or even the Mondragon network of collectives. But there's sort of three problems generally with a sort of semi-separatist experiment. First, we want to transform modern society. And in the long run, if these things become challenging, the US or China or Russia, or whichever industrialized authoritarian power, will crush them, right? The Spanish in 1930 learned that. They had built a radically separate horizontalist economy across a whole bunch of domains of human discourse. And when it came to fighting, well, basically the fascists, the communists, and the US, they lost. And it ushered in fascism. So, we got to figure out how to do this in a way that allows us to defend ourselves. Second, our goal isn't to have pockets of liberated people here and there. Our goal is to liberation generally. And that requires connection across all of these little experiments, as beautiful as they are in some ways. It's very cool. But, as the Zapatistas say, we're doing something locally, but we're looking for a world in which many worlds are possible. And that is to say, we're trying to find ways to connect to all of these other liberatory worlds that are going on. And finally, and maybe this is a variant on that second point, I want to talk about the situation we're in right now in 2024 America, right? We're facing the return of a Trump regime and fascist regimes on the ascendancy across most of the world. There's very, very few places in the world right now where the trend has been positive. Keep seeing these fucking memes about seceding to Canada. And I'm like, have you people looked at who's going to win the next Canadian election? It's going to be a Trumpite party. It's horrifying. And that's by far not the worst thing that we're looking at right now. And that means that in the next decade, as we're plotting out ways to teach ourselves these sort of, what I'm calling these sort of radical skills, we're going to be chasing disaster after disaster, right? We're going to be figuring out how to shelter trans folks from violence. We're going to be trying to figure out ways to stop mass deportations of immigrants. We're going to be trying to stop, probably most importantly, a direct and just horrifying assault on the human environment. The one thing that I think a lot of things are actually, it's less clear what Trump's going to do than people think it is, but it's absolutely clear that he's going to dismantle even the trivial liberal changes that the Biden administration allowed around environmental conditions. And these are things that aren't going to be fixed quickly, right? The damage done there will persist. And so, of course, if any people of conscience are going to be addressing those issues over the next decade, addressing those issues seriously is going to require working with a whole lot more people than the people that circle their A's, right? You take all the anarchists and Marxists or anything else that you might want to include there in America, and yet we don't have anything remotely close to a coalition that's going to confront these immediate, horrifying human rights problems. So we're going to be working with liberals. In some cases, we're going to be working with fucking corporations, right? Honestly, the most powerful group that will oppose mass deportations of immigrants. Let me just ask you this. Who is that? Who's going to oppose?
I don't know, big ag?
Yeah, of course. Agriculture, all our food is all picked by immigrants, by undocumented immigrants for the most part. They will collapse. There was actually about 15 years ago a huge push in Virginia for some sort of draconian identity checks for all workers. RJR Nabisco defeated it. This is one of the two giant conglomerates of agricultural corporations in America, because now, obviously the deeper problem here is that we have sort of two views about immigrants. One, the sort of democratic liberal view is let lots of them in and exploit the fuck out of them, because as they have no legal status, they can't unionize, and we can pay them less than other people and give them horrifying conditions, and they'll run our food and construction industry. That's the sort of good version in popular discourse. And the other is fuck those people, kick them out or arrest them or kill them or something. Those are the two positions. So I think for people with a kind of with a more radical conscience, the question that confronts us is, how do we right now work with other groups against that sort of Republican version of the problem in such a way that we build capacity to challenge the democratic version of this, right? We don't, I take it, want people to be exploited in the ways that standard industry does. And so not locking children in cages and sending people back to be tortured in regimes that we've put in place isn't remotely sufficient. But if we start with, say, join our No Borders group, they aren't going to. So I think the sort of right now tactical question is how we can both build for longer term radicalism, and that means bringing other ideas into things, and at the same time build enough of a coalition to actually accomplish something. Because it really doesn't matter if the 6 people on this screen right now agree on all the stuff, right? It just doesn't matter. Okay, so I'll give you another couple stories, and then I want to just talk with you about all this. So yeah, I guess I'll mention 3 different groups that I think have done this to some extent well. I want to mention, I don't know if you guys, most of you are young enough, you didn't live through the AIDS epidemic of the 80s and 90s. Amy knows this history. But I think the one movement that made the most difference in the least amount of time with the fewest resources in the history of the United States was the AIDS work done by ACT UP and other related organizations. There's been an absolutely profound change in people's attitudes toward gender and sexuality in our lifetime. I mean, people as old as me or nearly as old as me, like Amy. I mean, in 1970s, I lived in what would be considered a completely middle-class, politically middle-of-the-road suburb in a high school of about 7,000 people, and 0 people knew that they knew a gay person. That was Everybody was closeted in the late 1970s in America. Now, yes, there's pushback, there's violence and all of this, but not only do people know they know gay folks, they know trans folks. My daughter-in-law is trans. People are queer. We have an explosion of language around these issues, words that did not exist when we were young. And most of that comes from, or starts with, at least I'll say, the work of ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. Very briefly, this is a group, right, there was this plague that started, at least was first visible in the gay community, the gay male community in the United States. People started dying. At the time, you would get a diagnosis, and 3 months later, you were dead from typically multiple different carcinomas. I had numerous friends drop dead in their 30s. It was referred to as the gay plague. This was during the Reagan years, an administration that was utterly hostile to doing anything about it. You had the Cardinal of New York giving homilies where he said, well, this was awesome because this was God's plan to root out the sinners and the degenerates. In the face of this group arose that did a bunch of different things. Sort of on the practical level, they had a research arm that sent people around the world to speak to scientists and actually smuggle back drugs that weren't allowed in the US, but then also to meet with others. Amusingly, one of the people they met with was Anthony Fauci, who initially wasn't pushing any of this, any research on AIDS as head of, I think he was head of the FDA then, some organization, I forget. But after he actually met with a bunch of activists who started showing him what research was being done in a number of other countries, he turned into an ally on the issue. They had a popular education wing that was going into bathhouses and teaching people about safe sex and the need for that at a time when condoms were basically the only defense against AIDS. And they had a very radical street presence that was marching and occupying and doing incredibly creative street art, like dropping a giant condom over the house of a right-wing senator and stuff like that. And what I want to say is going back to the points I was making before about coalitions and training ourselves for radicalism, people were brought into this on the grounds that our community's dying and our government isn't doing shit about it, and we have to force them to do something. That was a pretty obvious, immediate, visceral demand, right? And nobody in the community or anyone, frankly, with a conscience was going to ignore that. But ACT UP didn't stop there, right? It wasn't just that. You've probably all heard the chant, "We're here, we're queer, get used to it." That started with ACT UP because they talked to people about how the closet was part of what allowed people to ignore this disease, and how teaching people that their loved ones and friends and acquaintances and coworkers might not have the same sexuality as them was a part of the process of educating around this. There was a big and well thought out kind of ideology behind the work that ACT UP was doing of much broader liberation than just give us drugs for AIDS. But it wasn't like immediately forced on people. It was a thing you sort of picked up in the work, in the process of doing this work. It was a volunteer organization. It was organized, there were leaders, but it was organized quite democratically. You learned forms of democratic coordination in the meetings. You learned more radical political things from talking to people that were taking you seriously and were, felt the same urgency you did. There's actually an awesome movie I want to plug here. It's called in English, it's just called BPM, Beats Per Minute. It's a French film about ACT UP organizing in Paris. And I think it's one of the best and most honest portrayals of organizing I've ever seen, because they give you see both the good and the bad, right? You see people being assholes. You see people's personal shit interfering with the work. And you also see people putting their lives on the line for each other and growing in the context of putting their lives on the line for each other. This actually goes back to a kind of Marxist theme of radical consciousness being built on the barricades. I don't want to go too far with that. I kind of would like to put that in conversation with a much more anarchist theme of prefigurative politics, of building movements that are structured in the way we want society broadly to be organized. Again, with the recognition that we'll learn more as we go along, but there's connections between these two. The second group I'll mention, in the early 2000s, there were sort of two things going on. The first was there was these massive demonstrations around the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank that began with Seattle. You've probably heard about the Seattle occupation of the city for several days, led by anarchists, but also in connection with people like labor unions and many others, a wide political range. And then that went on for many years, quite effectively. A year after Seattle was the start of the Second Palestinian Intifada. And an old friend of mine who's I had known in the US, who is now living in El Bira in the West Bank, contacted a few of us and said, we need to ramp up organizing because shit's going down again. And I won't go into all the political changes that were happening then, but so we started this group called Sustain, Stop US Tax Aid to Israel Now, which was, sort of going back to the ACT UP story. The immediate focus was US military aid to Israel. And a lot of people were concerned about that, wanted to get involved for that reason. We didn't have an explicit politics beyond that. But every meeting was built around consensus. We very consciously wanted people to respect certain voices more than others, like, say, the people from Palestine. But at the same time, they didn't dictate to anyone. Everyone had to kind of agree to all of our actions and moves and things like this. We had people that, like any group, brought very different skills. But one of our sort of early on kind of political practices was, if you're better at a certain skill than others, you need to get a whole team together and teach them to be as good as you are. So we had people that did street art. One person in particular was this amazing artist. She trained a whole bunch of new artists. I was good at public speaking because that's part of what I do for a living. So I trained other people to do that. In our first year, we did over 200 teach-ins at universities and political organizations and things like that. And we also started pairing all of our teach-ins with both people working on other issues and people from this global justice movement, so that these kind of, as we talked to people about what was going on in Palestine, it was connected as much as possible to these broader economic issues about, the exploitation that global capitalist imperialism brings about. Again, bring people in through something concrete that they care about, a concrete issue that matters, do it in a way that's inclusive and horizontalist in the local organizing, and do it in a way that raises issues naturally that are broader and more radical than that early on thing. I'll note that at the same time as I was doing this work, which was probably the most exciting and wonderful and fulfilling political work I've done in my life, and I've been doing this stuff for 45 years, never at any point did we call ourselves an anarchist organization or a socialist organization or anything like that. But that was the implicit politics of everything we did. At the same time, there were several explicitly anarchist organizations in DC. I went to several of them and quit going to all of them because, as one comrade quipped, these organizations are the kind of place where people will scream epithets at each other for 4 hours in an effort to reach consensus on ordering a vegan pizza. And this was not an unfair characterization, right? It was just like this. They were, they did some useful things, but they were still primarily like little competitions to see who could posture to be more radical and to have exactly the right view on this and that and the other thing. And whereas we were like, well, let's, we need to organize a protest of this war criminal who's coming to DC. Can we work on that now? Right. My friend Femi Taiwo, who's also teaches at Georgetown, a wonderful Marxist scholar and organizer and stuff. He recently put out a little thread on what's the new thing, Blue Sky, where he said many people are going into organizing right now. And he said, you're going to be confronted by 2 different kinds of groups. One is a group that wants you to do things, and the other is a group that wants you to be things. He said, and I strongly urge you to give thought to the former kind of group, right? That is, say, some groups, they want you to be the right kind of socialist or the right kind of anarchist or the right kind of whatever. Other groups want you to, like, occupy the fucking ICE facility. And I want to say you can do both of those, right? People can learn to be more radical, can learn to respect each other more, can learn to make decisions in a horizontal manner while occupying the ICE facility. But if the upfront goal is to make you the right kind of anarchist, A, half of them are going to leave, and B, you're going to be arguing for 4 hours about how to order a vegan pizza. So I don't have, this is not like, I'm not like giving you arguments that are like proofs, right? I do proofs sometimes. I've done some math in my day. I'm offering you my sort of sense of when and how organizing works best, and when it actually on the ground moves us closer to the forms of organization that anarchists care about. And I guess, what I want to say is that happens for the most part when we're not talking about what anarchism is, but simply, trying to respect each other, trying to listen to everyone, trying to recognize who's shut out of the discussion, who might have a background that gives them a perspective that's different from the ones that, someone that looks like me might assume. Okay, so, I'll stop there. Just by saying anything remotely recognizable as an anarchist future looks really distant right now. I mean, I don't know how y'all are feeling, but sure know a lot of people are in kind of despair. It's a lot of evil shit happening. A lot of liberal institutions are being torn down, and not in good ways. There's a book by Astra Taylor called Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Sure Miss It When It's Gone, which I think is kind of a brilliant title, and it's quite a wonderful book as well. I do think in that presence, I keep urging people to read history. There's a kind of American exceptionalism that came out when, like at 9/11, people are like, this has never happened before. I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? There's countries where this is like a Thursday. It's just like you've lived such a privileged life away from the violence that your country traces it. Well, and now, I mean, it's like, okay, yeah, this shit is scary, but this is not Franco murdering thousands of people. This is not Pinochet throwing people out of helicopters. This is not a lot of things. People have organized and come back from vastly more horrifying and oppressive situations than we're in right now, which isn't to say it's not urgent, that this can't go really, really badly, but, a little perspective and a little, backbone in a certain way. People have fought back from far worse. But, to put radical things on the agenda, I think right now is simply not going to work if it's, here's our anarchist group, come join us to overthrow capitalism. But that doesn't mean that we aren't committed to overthrowing capitalism. I certainly am. I mean, I'm going to die before it happens, I'm quite sure, but I would sure like to move us a step closer to that. But I think the way we move a step closer to that, again, is through building coalitions that show people that our organizing principles actually work, not through teaching them a theory from the beginning. Okay, so I'll stop there, and you guys can disagree, question, whatever. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure thing.
Let's
Did
stop the
you want to
recording.
take a break, you said, for a minute?
Yeah, let me just stop the recording now. We don't